He sent me.
Okay. Oh, that's right. She
Linda, do
did.
you see the sign? Do you see that the blue? Can you push the blue button?
Yeah, let me see here.
Can you do that?
Yeah,
Does it work?
I guess.
You
Is
don't see it anymore?
What? I'm sorry?
You don't see it anymore, right?
No, I see all of them that were there.
Okay, then I am done helping. Thank you, Dave, for that moment.
You're so welcome.
Is that okay, Dave?
And it's so nice now, forever and ever in archives, we have that little teaching segment
Well, thank you.
preserved forever.
I'd like to be there forever.
All right,
you.
everybody. We are on going to be starting on page 43, even though it does not have a page number. So just go to 44 and back up one, but it's the first letter. So we're starting a whole new section of the book. We're going to be going through the letters. And I really like the letters. The letters are great because, I don't know, they just have a different flavor to them because he's writing directly to the recipient. And so instead of being in the third person, instead of being paraphrased the way that the conversations were after the fact, these have kind of an immediacy to them, and they show a little bit more of Lawrence's personality, even though it's coming kind of stilted through the translation. I think you'll see the difference in the tone and the quality of these letters as we go through. Let's see, Jerry, you had a Kindle too, right there? Oh, you have a book now. Okay, great. Okay. So before we jump in, oh, here comes Marion. Before we jump in, does anyone have anything from last week? Anything that you've been thinking about during the week that you want to throw in on before we get going? Any old business, as we say? Okay. Sounds like we got a clean slate. Hi, Marion.
Hello from the next room.
Yes, she is. All right. Okay. I am honoring the silence. 1, 2, going 3 times. Here we go. Okay, so the first letter. So the first thing we notice on the first letter is that it's to Reverend Mother N. And we don't have a name because he's preserving her anonymity. Now, if it's to the Reverend Mother, then we know that she is the superior of a convent or a woman's group. And so she is going to be the big cheese over at this other convent. The other thing that you notice, if you go to the last page of the letter, is that it was written on June 1st, 1682. So all of the conversations took place in 1666 when Brother Lawrence was 52 years old. These letters are taking place in 1682 when he's 68 years old. So he's a lot older now, and writing these letters to people that he has connections with. And I think we'll find, as this letter goes on, certain questions that that may pop up in the way that he addresses her and the things that he's talking about, as if they've already spoken. We'll find out that they already had spoken. They had a relationship. They probably had conversations before. And then this is a letter that he wrote her that was preserved. So it's, again, it's just interesting because you're reading someone else's mail, right? So it's kind of cool that way. You're getting an inside scoop. But like any letter that you read that wasn't sent to you is kind of like a Jeopardy game where you get the answers, but not the questions, right? And so especially with the letters of Paul and the evangelist in the New Testament, the epistles, it's absolutely that way because they are addressing issues that everybody knows about. And so you're getting their responses, you're getting their answers to questions, you're getting their directives, how to handle certain situations, but they're not going to burn the page, the ink and the space to recount what those situations are because everybody already knows them. And so you kind of have a situation like that here where he's talking to this Reverend Mother, this nun, and they've already got some things established and they've talked about and they understand. And so he is talking to her from that base. And so we're the ones that have to try to dig in a little bit and see if we can glean what must have taken place before to elicit this response that he's giving her. Okay? So let's dive in and read a little bit. Reverend Mother, I am taking this opportunity to acquaint you with the reflections of one of our religious on the wonderful effects and the continual assistance he is receiving from the presence of God. Let the both of us profit from them. Okay, who's he talking about?
Himself.
Yeah, he's talking about himself. So this is a common thing that happens in some sacred writings, is that out of humility and out of staying out of the way, the person will talk about themselves in the third person. We see John doing that in his gospel. So in the Gospel of John, John himself is never referred to by name. He's always referred to as either the disciple whom Jesus loved or the one who laid his head on Jesus' chest at the Last Supper. But he never names himself specifically, and that's done out of humility. So throughout this letter, Brother Lawrence is going to be speaking about himself in the third person and not naming himself. And sometime in the shorthand for a religious person, a person who is living in a religious order, is just religious. So when he talks about one of our religious, he's talking about a monk. He's talking about a man who has joined a religious order. So I'm taking this opportunity to acquaint you with the reflections of one of our religious on the wonderful effects and the continual assistance he is receiving from the presence of God. Let the both of us profit from them. You should know that his principal concern during his more than 40 years in religion has to be with God always, to do nothing, to say nothing, and to think nothing that would displease him, solely for the love of him, and because he deserves infinitely more. And so here he's talking about he is now 40 years in the monastery. That's a long time, 68 years old. He is now so accustomed to this divine presence that he receives continual aid from it in all circumstances. For almost 30 years, his soul has been filled with interior joys. Do you remember why he's saying for 30 years? He's been 40 years in the monastery, in the abbey, but he says for almost 30 years his soul has been filled with interior joys. Do you remember why there would be a discrepancy there?
It was miserable his first 10 years, right?
Yeah, that's it exactly, William. Especially those first 4 years. Remember? I mean, he equated his first 4 years to kind of being in hell. He was so distraught. He was so torn up by the idea that he was going to hell. And then it was that first 10 years that he really struggled, hanging out in the kitchen and doing that dirty work. He was not a happy camper. It took him a good 10 years, a full decade, before he really broke through into this kind of awareness of God's presence that then followed him everywhere. So even though he's been in the order for 40 years, he says, for almost 30 years, his soul, my soul, has been filled with interior joys so continual and sometimes so great that to contain them and prevent their outward manifestation, he has resorted to behavior that seems more foolish than piety. What do you think he's going on about there? Okay, his joy is so continual and sometimes so great that to contain them and to prevent their outward manifestations, prevent other people to seeing how happy feet he has, right? He has resorted to behavior that seems more foolishness than piety. Now, that other translation that I was telling you about, they translate this as he's resorted to childish gestures, more madness than devotion, was the way the other translation put it. So I'm trying to picture what that would look like. Either behavior that seems more foolish than piety or childish gestures. Is he talking about some kind of like Tourette syndrome where he's kind of has facial tics and it's kind of jerking a little bit? Is he talking about, kind of like when a child gets shy and they kind of hide their face. Is he doing things like that? I mean, trying to pick, what would that look like? If you had some interior joy that you felt was not going to be received well, if you really let it out, you know, because a lot of these religious types are pretty dour, you know, and they're all serious and pious and all that.
He's like David and his chonies.
Say that again, Juan.
It was like David and his chonies dancing in front of the ark, right?
You know what he's talking about there? David
No.
dancing in his underwear before the Ark of the Covenant. When the Ark is finally brought back to Jerusalem under David's command, he is so ecstatic that the Ark is finally coming home that he strips down to his underwear, you know, the under the tunic that they would wear underneath, and he is dancing wildly around the Ark as it's being carried in procession into the city. And his wife Michal is just livid watching him from the window from the tower. But yeah, maybe, but see, he's trying to hide that kind of energy, that kind of outward manifestations. And so I'm just picturing what that looked like. And I don't know if any of you have an image of what that might look like. But you know, if you're going to smile real big and you're trying to hide it, you know, do you put your hand over your face? I mean, I don't know. It's but it's going to have to be something like that. And it's just such an amusing picture to try to paint that he is just bursting at the seams. You know, he wants to do a David underwear dance, and he can't do it. He's got to hide it somehow. So he's just like, I know. You, those of you who have dogs or puppies, and you told them to be still, and they're just like vibrating, waiting because you're holding the treat over their head, and they want it so bad, but you know, I think it's something like that.
I wonder if it was, you know, I mean, he seemed to take great joy out of having the presence of God meet him right where he was at with doing mundane chores. That maybe, I mean, I always imagined him as doing those by himself, you know, and maybe when some of the monks might come by the kitchen or whatever, and he was scrubbing the floors or whatever, he might have been having a conversation with himself or with God, you know, and just breaking out in laughter, or, you know, just based on what he was experiencing. I don't know. That's kind of it. And the smiles, and just, you know, it was probably atypical of the other religious in his community that, as you mentioned, kind of dour, you know, and he would be so unusual in that respect. I don't know. That's what I kind of imagine.
Yeah. Well, this is all we get. We get that one little line that he says, you know, resorted to behavior that seems more foolish than piety, or childish gestures more madness than devotion. And yet I think in that one little line, it's telling us so much about his personality, about the extent of his relationship with God, the immediacy of it, the way he felt about it, that it was visceral, that it was emotional, that it was just so real to him, that it was just bursting out. And yet he felt that he had to put it under wraps. So I don't know. I just love that line. And I think, and trying to imagine what it would have looked like. I've been coming up with these scenarios, you know, what have I experienced? You know, I don't know. Maybe it's like when you're in the classroom when you were a kid and something, you know, was funny between you and your classmate, but you couldn't laugh, and you're trying to hold it in, you know.
You're spurting.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like that. Haven't we all been there? Or in church, you know, something's funny.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
You gotta hold it in. You can't go for it. You know?
Exactly. Kind of like dance like nobody's looking.
Yeah. So he's got this joy in his heart, and he's trying to hold it in. So this continual, and sometimes this joy that is continual and sometimes so great that contain them and prevent their outward manifestations, he has resorted to behavior that seems more foolish than piety. If sometimes he strays a bit from that divine presence, God makes himself felt in his soul to recall it to him. Often when he is engaged in his regular duties, he responds with strict fidelity to these interior entreaties, either by lifting up his heart to God, or by a sweet and loving gaze, or by such words as love fashions on these occasions. For example, my God, here I am, all yours. Lord, make me according to your heart. And then it seems to him that this God of love, satisfied with these few words, returns and rests again in the very depths of his soul. These experiences make him so certain that God is always in the depths of his soul that there is no longer any doubt in his mind about it under any circumstances.
Wow.
What a paragraph, huh?
Uh-huh.
I mean, just the choice of words, the way he describes this relationship is as if with I don't know, like with your child, maybe with a very devoted friend, you know. I suppose it could be with a, you know, with a romantic interest as well. And many of the mystics resort to sexual language because it's the only language that can capture the sense of intimacy that they have with God. You know, even though obviously sex has nothing to do with it, but it's the only way they can try to capture that sense of intimacy and connection. But he's doing a pretty good job here. You know?
Yeah.
I mean, his writing is this. I think the writing in this letter, some of the images he evokes and the metaphors, it's really good writing for someone who is uneducated, right? So as we break this down a little bit, if sometimes he strays a bit from that divine presence, God makes himself felt in his soul to recall it to him. All right, so he's lost the connection. Obviously, we're talking about mind wandering here, right? We've talked about that often, where we're trying to be mindful, and mindfulness is, we're going to define it as that the only thought in your head is on the task at hand, on what you're actually doing. Your mind is not wandering away from whatever is happening in the moment. That way you are connected. And even when you are the most connected to what you're doing at the moment, you're not even thinking about it in words. You're just present to it and doing it. You're aware without thinking about it. That's the most connected we can be to something, is when we are not putting words between us and that thing, that person, whatever it is that's happening at the moment. But when our mind wanders away on a topic that has nothing to do with that, and we lose that connection with the presence, I love this because Brother Lawrence is not immune to that. And we think that he is constantly in connection with God, and how in the world could we ever aspire to do that? But he's telling us right there, sometimes he wanders away too. But when he does, he has this sixth sense of God's presence that pulls him back again. It's almost like a balloon on a string or a dog on a leash. You know, he doesn't get too far before he feels that tug again, and it pulls him back in, back to center. And there's a sense of this intimate familiarity, almost like a wordless conversation going on between him and God, so that even when he's pulled away cognitively, there's something deeper that's pulling him back in, reeling him back into the present.
Dave, I don't know if this really fits, but this is what came to my mind. As you all know, I went back to Maryland to see my new granddaughter. And as I was reading this, I just pictured her face. When I look at this tiny little infant and see her smile at me, I feel the presence of God. I mean, it's that very intimate connection that with this little baby that can't talk and can't, you know, all she can do is smile at me. It's just, I don't know, my heart swells for her, but then it also makes me think, well, that's what he's talking about. That's what it feels like, you know, that presence that God came within. And so when I see here and I see the miracle of this precious little 1-month-old baby, that's what came to me. I don't know if that makes sense to anybody else.
It does. Now here's the thing, Jerry. Now that you're 3,000 miles away from her,
yeah.
How often does something like a heartstring pull you back to thoughts about her again? Is that happening?
Yes, yes. And then my daughter just sent me some new pictures that's on my Nix Play, and the same thing happened. I see this, you know, they had this, you know, some pictures of her, and again, I felt that same heartstring, and it does remind me God created this beautiful, precious child, and the feelings I feel for her, I want to feel those things with God all the time. But like you said, you can't, even Brother Lawrence didn't do it all the time, but I'm getting better at it. I'm getting better at connecting with that feeling.
How do you feel about your when people say, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that my microphone was on. I usually keep it down and then I realize it is, but this popped in my mind. And Jerry, how do you feel about yourself? Like wanting that connection with God is getting to be able to have that personal connection with yourself as well, and having those feelings internally as well. That really helps with that connection with God. So that's just something that accidentally got thrown out there. Not knowing how you feel, but that's just, yep.
Yep, it's true. It's true. It does bring an interconnection with God, because I relate to how I feel about her, and then I relate it to that's how I want to feel about God on a regular basis,
Mhm.
and bring it internally. Yes.
That's great. So I think we need to use our human emotions as the anchor point, because when Brother Lawrence speaks about his connection with God, he speaks about it in terms that sound like a human relationship, right?
Mhm.
And so I think we need to realize, and when Jesus uses analogies, he talks about our relationship with God the way our relationship with our children is, right? If you who are imperfect know how to give good things to your children, how much more, that Kale Homer argument. And so those analogies hold for us. And since we're human beings, all of our relationships, whether they're spiritual as with God or whether they're physical, are going to be filtered through the same apparatus. So I think it's important for us to watch the way that we are drawn in our human relationships, because it's going to feel the same. That's why I was asking Jerry, okay, now that you're 3,000 miles away from your granddaughter, how often is that tug being felt to bring you back, or bring her back into remembrance, to bring you back into presence with her as if you were there, with all that emotional connection that you had when you actually were there. When I was taking singing lessons, I remember the singing coach saying, you're working with muscles that you can't see. You're trying to control apparatus that's not visible to you. It's not like learning a guitar where you can see your fingers and you can help move them the way that they need to move. So he said, you just sing. And when I hear a correct tone, I'm going to tell you, and then notice how it feels in your mask, in your throat, and everything. And then memorize the feeling and recreate the feeling. Because when you are singing with the right feeling, you will be singing with the right tone. So we don't go at it directly, you go at it indirectly by remembering, memorizing, and recreating the feelings. And so maybe we can approach our spirituality in the same way. If we know how we are drawn to each other in human relationships, maybe we can cultivate that same feeling in our relationship with God. And I think that's what Brother Lawrence is trying to express to us, that there is this there's this tug, there's this heartstring, call it whatever you want to call it, but a tether that he has developed in his relationship with God by practicing presence for all these decades, so that even when he strays, he only strays so far and then he's pulled back again. And I think maybe we can use our human relationships to know a little bit about what that feels like, so that we can bring that back to bear in our relationship with God as well. Because ultimately, I don't know how much we love God directly. We love God by loving each other, but there is a deeper spiritual connection to God's presence that I think may be unique in our human experience.
Judy, I was curious because you have 2 grandbabies. I mean, could you relate to what I was sharing?
Oh yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
When I see pictures of Poppy or Noah, that either I was part of or was a new experience for them, I just get totally filled up.
Yeah.
And sometimes it just brings tears to my eyes,
Uh-huh.
and I've often felt that even being here, in California, when they're way out there. And they do float in sometimes into my quiet time with God. And I do get totally filled up and feel so grateful, and I'm directing that to the God that I know, that I have the quality of these relationships, and I've been able to experience these two young lives, blooming in front of me, with such energy and difference, between my two grandkids. It's just, I'm just filled with wonder. I really am.
So now the next part of this is, what does he do? What does Lawrence do when he feels that tug, when he feels the leash tighten and start to pull him back again? He says, often when Brother Lawrence is engaged in his regular duties, okay, he's just going through his day, doing the things that he's obliged to do, right? And his mind has wandered away. He's not focused and is not any more aware of God's presence. But then he feels this tug. He responds with strict fidelity to these interior entreaties. That's that interior tug of God pulling and reeling him back in, either by lifting up his heart to God, that we can try to interpret what that means, or by a sweet and loving gaze, or by such words as love fashions on these occasions. For example, my God, here I am, all yours. Lord, make me according to your heart. And so when he feels that tug, he responds in some way. Either he calls it lifting up his heart to God. To me, that is just coming back to an absolute awareness and consciousness of God's presence again. Lifting up your heart to God, coming back into the moment and being aware that God is present in that moment. Or a sweet and loving gaze, kind of the same thing, it's just bringing that focus back to God's presence, and then actually speaking a short prayer, a mantra, anything that locks him back in to that sense of presence. It's almost like the welcoming practice, if you're familiar with the welcoming practice.
Yeah.
It's almost like saying your sacred word in centering prayer. When your mind wanders off and you come back to the sacred word, or in welcoming practice where you notice the emotion that is pulling you out and triggering you, you sit in it, you welcome it, and then you say a short prayer to bring you back through the emotion and back to the present moment again. It's almost like a welcoming practice that he's doing here, a 3-step process to come back again. And so that's how he responds. His mind has wandered off, like ours is going to do every 5 minutes all day long. And as soon as we feel the tug back again, we respond in one of these ways or combinations of ways to lock ourselves back into the moment and to God's presence. Pretty cool. And then when he does this, it seems to him that this God of love, satisfied with these few words, doesn't take much to make God happy, right? Returns and rests again. And in the other translation, I thought it was kind of interesting. They say, God, satisfied with these few words, returns and goes back to sleep in the very depths of his soul. That's kind of an interesting image of God just resting and sleeping in the depths of your soul, present, but not exerting himself, not announcing himself, right? Just there. And these experiences make him so certain that God is always in the depths of his soul, that there is no longer any doubt in his mind about it under any circumstances. Just imagine the immediacy that he feels in his relationship with God. I mean, it's almost like those annoying PDAs you see some couples running around and doing. They're always, all those annoying displays of public affection or public displays of affection, right? It's just like, oh, get a room. Come on. I mean, this is sort of the way he lives with his God. It's so amazing the way he describes it. Okay, continuing on. You may judge from this, Reverend Mother, what contentment and what satisfaction he enjoys. Continually having within himself so great a treasure, and no longer suffering the pain and anxiety of looking for and finding it. It is completely revealed and available to him, and he may take of it what he pleases.
Mhm.
That's huge. It's as if he walking around is a complete statement. He walking around is a consummated relationship within himself with God's presence. That it's almost as if he can't be lonely ever, because he always finds himself alone with God. You know, it also sounds a little delusional, I'll grant you that, but it's such an amazing statement he's making here. It's funny because I'm reading this book again for the first time in several years, and it strikes, I don't know, for those of you who have read it before, you know, and anything that you read, it'll strike you different at different times in your life. And so what reading this paragraph struck me as a type of Trinity. You know, the Trinity, as we understand the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Spirit, and the best way that I think we can understand it is that love always has an object, right? Love always has a beloved. Love is never alone, or you really can't consider it love. And so the Trinity is that interior relationship within the Godhead that is always in motion. You know, that idea of the perichoresis of the ancient Eastern Greek fathers, the circle dance, you know, that whirling blur of the Greek dance where they're moving so quickly, it looks like it's fused into one. That idea of the motion of the three, but it's completely contained. There is love and lover. There is love and the beloved, and it's all contained. And it's almost as if within Brother Lawrence himself, he feels that kind of complete statement that he and God are fused. You may judge from this Reverend Mother what contentment and what satisfaction he enjoys, continually having within himself so great a treasure, and no longer suffering the pain and anxiety of looking for and finding it. He's not looking out there anymore for God's presence, for God's love. It's not somewhere to be found. Just like Jesus said, you're not going to find the kingdom out there by observation, right? Luke 17, right? I think. It's not, no, you're not going to be able to say, look, there it is, or here it is. It's within, it's already here. Brother Lawrence is saying the same thing. I don't have to go looking for it. I don't have to have the anxiety of wondering where it is and trying to find it and uncover it and acquire it and make it mine. You know? It's already completely revealed and available, and I may take of it what I please, to put it back in first person. These are really incredible statements if you break them up.
Yeah, they are.
So he continues in the third person. He complains often of our blindness, constantly crying out that we are to be pitied for our willingness to be satisfied with so little. Now, this is looking at it from the other side, okay? He's talking about now his brethren in the Abbey, right? And just people in general, and himself before he had this revelation or this connection with God's Spirit. So he's complaining of humanity's blindness, constantly crying out that we are to be pitied. He is crying out for humanity to be pitied for our willingness to be satisfied with so little. God, he says, has infinite treasures to give us, and still we are satisfied with a brief passing moment of piety, that we were blind, and by our blindness we restrain the hand of God, and so stop the flow of the abundance of his graces. Okay, there's a lot there. So he is saying that God has infinite treasures to give us. As Jesus says, I come to bring life and bring it abundantly. We always approach life from the position of scarcity, right? But Jesus is approaching it from abundance. We already have everything within that we will ever need. There is nothing more to get. That's also what Lawrence is saying. It's already here. I don't need to be anxious about trying to find it. You know, talk about Fox Mulder sometime with the X-Files. The truth is out there. No, The truth is in here. It's already here. It's like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. Next time she goes looking for her heart's desire, she's not going to look any further than her own backyard, because if it's not there, I never lost it to begin with. When she returns from her hero's journey and comes back home to black and white Kansas. Same idea over and over again with a hero's journey, with these motifs from the scripture. God has infinite treasures to give us, and still we are satisfied with a brief passing moment of piety. The way the other translation translated that was a brief passing tangible devotion. So what he's talking about are the ritual devotions that we do. You know, in his case, it would have been when he was called to prayer in the chapel, and they chanted, you know, the Psalms, or they did whatever they did, and they had their time of, they said the Mass, and they did all the devotions that they did, as if that were the sum total of their connection with God. He's saying that is just so little. It's pitiable. He's crying out against it, because they're missing what is really here on a moment by moment basis, not relegated to certain times and certain activities, but just completely seamless. And by our blindness, we restrain the hand of God and so stop the flow of the abundance of his graces. How do we stop the flow of God's abundance? Is that possible to stop the flow of God's abundance? Allison, your head was going up and down. What were you thinking just then?
I mean, it just, that honestly, this last couple paragraphs just have so much in it. It's kind of like, wow. I mean, I believe that, where, like, if we're not present, we're unable to see exactly what was stated before, that everything we have is, everything we need is in this moment. Like, we need, like, well, just what you were saying, approaching life from an abundant state of mind and knowing like we have everything we need. And when we're out of that feeling and that understanding, then we're fearful, we're anxious, uncomfortable. I'm never going to be good enough. Nobody loves me. What's going on? Where am I going to get the money to do this? What, you know, and that's kind of the state. But when we can have this state of like, I have everything I need, then it's just like a constant flow of just love, right? That, I hope that makes sense.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
Dave, I was having a conversation with a client earlier who had a peak experience where he felt like the presence of God, or this divine consciousness, however you want to put it. And it happened when he was in Hawaii. And then he went back to Hawaii trying to find that experience again, and ended up having a relapse on alcohol during his trip while looking for this spiritual whatever. And the conversation we had today was about this idea that if we think that God only exists in this divine peak experience, then we limit our experience to God, of God, to that experience.
Yeah.
And this is kind of reminding me of that conversation, this idea that God is always present, even when we're feeling good and when we're feeling bad. You know, and this belief that I am somehow, like God is not walking alongside me when I'm going through it, is part of the problem, you know. And I really like this idea of these passing moments of piety, you know, like when we're in church, and you know, and I think you talked about this before, like the idea like we come to church to refuel, you know.
Right. Right.
And I totally do that, right? I go to church to refuel, but you can refuel anywhere all the time. You know,
that is so classic about your clients going back to the island to try to find, you know, what he found there before. You know, it reminds me, there was this great line by Harrison Ford in, it was a funny movie, 6 Days, 7 Nights. And he turns to the woman, he says, "It's an island, babe. if you don't bring it here, you won't find it here. And it's just so perfect, you know, that we would think that, you know, it's there in the volcanic rock, you know, on Oahu. It's over there someplace. And we
Right.
do this all the time. It's at church. It's in Israel. It's in Rome. It's someplace else. It must be, because it doesn't feel like it's in here. And so I got to go find it. I got to make this pilgrimage. And there's nothing wrong with pilgrimages. They can be beautiful. But every step of the pilgrimage is just as significant as any other step of the pilgrimage. And that's the genius of Brother Lawrence. He figured that out. He experienced it. He lived it. And until we do that, then we're always going to be chasing something. We're always going to be waiting for something. And if we're waiting for something, guess what? We're not in the present. Our head is in the future someplace. We're waiting for something to arrive that we imagine is not here. And Jesus, first thing he says out the chute, Mark 1:15, the waiting is over. The kingdom is here. And that's the whole shift. That if we don't get that shift, then we don't get it. You know, we're always going to be waiting for God's presence rather than experiencing God's presence. And yes, we cannot stop the flow of God's abundance. That's impossible. But what Allison was pointing out is, if we're not aware of the flow, then we might as well have stopped it. It's not flowing for us. It's not flowing in us. So we can certainly stop that. I mean, we really can't, but we can just not be aware of that it's there. And the effect is the same for us at that point. And so he's crying out. He's grieved by the fact that all these people around him aren't seeing what he sees. They don't see the brightness of the colors. They don't taste the savoriness of the food. They don't feel what he's feeling. And it just is, you know, almost makes him crazy a little bit because of our blindness, that we stop the flow of God's abundance, his grace. But when God, finds a soul imbued with the living faith, he pours into it his graces in abundance. It is like a torrent, forcibly diverted from its usual course, having found a passage, pours through irresistibly in an overwhelming flood. That's pretty darn poetic for an uneducated guy.
Yeah, really.
Love that.
Mm.
Great image.
Yeah.
Yes, often we restrain this torrent by ignoring it. There it is, stated out flat, right? We restrain this torrent by ignoring it. Let us hold it back no longer, my dear mother. Let us return into ourselves. Let us break this dike that dams it. Let us make way for grace. Let us make up for lost time. For perhaps we have little time left to live. Death is close behind us. We die only once, so let us be prepared. So he's milking this metaphor for all he can get.
I wonder if she had a crisis of faith, you know, or was overwhelmed by her circumstances in her particular abbey or cloister or wherever she was.
See, I think you're getting right down to it, Judy. I think that's exactly what happened. And in their previous conversations, they had found a kindred spirit in each other. And we'll hit this as we hit the next paragraph. But something must have happened where she was having this dark night of the soul. Something was going on in her, which is eliciting this response in him, right? Because just look at this next paragraph then. Again, I say, let us return into ourselves. Time presses down on us. And each man, each woman is responsible for himself. Or, as it is in the other translation, each man, each woman faces death alone. I believe you have taken the proper measures and so will not be taken by surprise. I admire you for it, for that is our responsibility. Or in the other translation, that is what life is all about. So he's alluding, right, to the fact that she has already put in place much of what he's talking about. Either they had a conversation before, she put it into practice, and he was kind of maybe coaching her through it, or they were talking at intervals through it, and recognized in her developing this practice of presence. But something broke down, apparently, and now he's coming back to her in letter form and trying to help. Because what are these measures? Are these measures just for herself? Or was it measure she was putting down on her convent for the other nuns to follow? Was it both? We're not told. But there was something that she was doing that he felt was exactly on a par with what he was doing. And so that she was living her life as if each day could be the last day that she spends on earth. She was living with a real connection with God's presence. But now he's coming back to her and it looks like trying to help her through the dark night. Nevertheless, we must persevere, since in the spiritual life, not to advance is to come on, Dave, not to advance is to retreat. Now, in the I thought the other translation was interesting also. Nevertheless, we must continue to labor. All right, continue to labor or must persevere, since in the spiritual life, not to advance is to retreat. One thing I find myself telling couples when I'm counseling couples a lot is that relationships are never static. They're always in motion. So if they're not moving closer together, they're moving further apart. And the only way relationships move closer together is if you are putting energy into them. If you're not putting energy into the relationship, it's not going to stay static. It's not going to stay where you left it. It's going to grow further apart until you put energy back in, and then it'll start moving closer together. And I think that's exactly what he's saying here. We must always be putting energy into this relationship. We must continue to labor. We must persevere. In the spiritual life, not to advance is to retreat. If we're not putting that relationship into our relationship, putting the energy into our relationship with God, then we're losing ground, just like with any relationship that we experience, because we're human beings. And so even our relationship with God is still going to be experienced through the vessel of our humanity, right? But those who have been breathed on by the Holy Spirit move forward even while sleeping. I love that. If the vessel of our soul is still battered by winds or by storm, let us call on our Lord who rests therein. He will soon calm the sea. There are so many allusions here. This is just really cool what he's doing here. If you remember the story of Jesus, the parable that Jesus tells about the gardener, the farmer, he goes out and he does all the work. He tills the soil, he plants the seed, he covers it back over, he does the weeding, he waters, he gets everything ready, right? And then what does he do? He goes home and goes to sleep. And while he's sleeping, all this stuff is happening under the soil that he knows nothing about and has no control over. And when he wakes up the next morning, there's this little plant popped its head above the ground, right? All that happened while he was sleeping. But look at all the work that he had to do to make the preparation for that miracle to happen over which he had no control. See, I think either Brother Lawrence had that in mind, or he's just thinking along the same lines that Jesus is thinking in terms of the experience of how this works. Because ultimately, we don't have control over the miracle, but if we don't make the preparations to put ourselves in the place of presence, we're not going to be aware of the miracle when it happens. We're not going to be aware of the connection. And then in the back end of this, he's alluding to Jesus calming the storm at sea, right?
Mm-hmm.
Remember the story? Jesus says, let's go to the other side of the lake. And so they all get in the boat together. And as they're in the middle of the lake, this storm crops up and Jesus is asleep down in the keel of the ship. And they're getting blown about and everybody's terrified. And they go and they scream at Jesus, don't you care that we're going to die? Don't you care that we're going under? And Jesus gets up, bleary-eyed, looks around and holds out his hand and calms the sea. And how little faith you all have. And of course, they're marveling at that. But here's the image that Lawrence is trying to get, that Jesus is asleep in the keel at the bottom of our souls, as if he were at the bottom of that ship. And we're the ones getting buffeted about and all worried about these many things. And yet all we have to do is realize Jesus is there. He's going to get us through the storm. It's going to be okay. But if we're not connected to that presence, then we're still anxious. We're still worried. We're still looking out there for something that is already in here. Beautiful imagery.
Yes. Yeah.
And then the last paragraph, We're going to actually be able to say we did a whole letter in one night. How about that?
Wow.
And this is where I think he brings it together in terms of what Judy, what you were talking about. I have taken the liberty, my very dear mother, of sharing some of these reflections with you so that you may compare them with your own. They will serve to rekindle and inflame yours if by some misfortune, which God forbid, as that would be a great ill, they should have, even if by ever so little, cooled down. Let you and I then recall our first fervors. Let us profit from the examples and sentiments of this religious, little known to the world, but known to God. Now he's talking about himself again, right? Let us profit from the examples and sentiments of this religious, in other words, me. Little known to the world, but known to God and well beloved by him. I would request that same love for you and earnestly request it for me, who am in our Lord. So I think that sort of brings it full circle. So we realize he had this relationship with this nun. They had either separately found the presence of God and then were talking about it and comparing notes and realizing they were kindred spirits, or maybe Brother Lawrence had coached her in how he did it, and then she entered in, and then they found their kindred spirits. And then something happened where she was really going through it. And he is encouraging her. He's reminding her of their first love, their first fervor, and trying to bring her back online. But it's just a kind of a beautiful testament to the kind of relationship that they had, and the care that he's taking with her. You know, my very dear mother, you know, I've taken the liberty of sharing some of these reflections with you. It's very tender. It's very touching.
Yes. It reminds me too, I think for me, the humanity in this paragraph also that he's talking about, that we can, for some periods of time, we can live with that flame that's just building and growing, and the fervor is there, but then something rocks us, you know, in life, and it goes away, you know, for whatever reason. And we need each other, you know, to help us get back on track. And he's come alongside her in such a beautiful way. It's stunning.
It reminds me of the story of Mother Teresa when it came in the news, how she had that fervor and she lost it, and she was asking her spiritual advisor.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And it was for 60 years, Ellen, right?
Hmm.
That she was feeling that disconnection. And yet she kept showing up and doing what she
That's
did.
right.
And the world had no clue until her
Yeah.
letters, her
Yeah.
confessory letters were published, you know, what, 15 years ago, something or something.
Yeah. But I think that's also what it means to have courage. Although I don't feel it, I will continue to do this. Like you said, showing up.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Perseverance.
So do you see what I mean about the different, the tone of these letters as compared to the conversations? You know, it's so much more immediate. It's so much more human. And the beautiful thing is that we're presented with these people. I mean, we don't know who Reverend Mother N is. We have no idea. And Brother Lawrence is just a name to us. But they're coming alive in the pages of these letters in such a way that makes them so accessible and so human. I mean, they are facing the exact same things that you and I face on a daily basis. There's no difference. Even though it was 300 years ago, you know, 350 years ago, people are people. The only thing that separates us is technology. You know, they're going through the same things we do. And if we try to imagine that it was somehow easier for them because it was such a simpler time and you could see the stars at night, or they didn't have social media, any of the things that you might imagine that makes this easier for them, just realize how hard it still was, because whatever distractions we do have in life, those are the ones that take over. I mean, there's no difference in that. And while he was in a monastery, he didn't have to worry about paying bills. No, but he had other things. Everything's a mixed bag.
Mhm.
He didn't get to have a spouse. He didn't get to have children. He didn't get to have families. He didn't, there's so many things that he gave up in order to be there in a religious setting. And so it evens out. And so to see that and to see that they're facing the same things we do, give us this one-to-one correspondence in terms of how what they went through and what they left us in these letters can help us to do exactly the same thing in terms of finding this presence and making it a part of our daily lives, you know, and giving ourselves a break when we can't hold that connection throughout the day, because they didn't either. And this Reverend Mother was going through a really bad time, and she needed Lawrence to kind of pull her out of the ditch. We've all been there too, and we'll be there again. So it just really, I think, puts it back into the realm of reality, daily reality. And that's very cool.
Mhm.
All right. Any final words? Burning desires. That you're thinking of.
I like listening to it.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Ken, were you able to follow at all with the
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That
Oh,
my translation was extremely different, but in sometimes I thought, wow, that's a really interesting way they translated that. But I'm going to have to get the paperback. It's quite different. So they were on the same page. I had the option for the Kindle or the paperback, and by getting the Kindle, I got a completely different translation. So
Oh, shoot.
You got to watch Amazon. They're really sneaky that way. I've found that you know, you really got to watch, because you'll get all the way to the checkout and realize you got something different, even though you went in through the portal. So I know what you're talking about.
I'll get the paperback that you linked and make sure the cover's the same. And
Yeah.
I'm such a digital book guy, though. So
I hear you. I hear you. Well, good to have you here, and I'm glad you were able to stick with us. That's perfect. All right.
it was really good.
Mhm.
All right. Well, then let's
Sure
go
will.
ahead and we'll close it here. We'll start with the second letter next week. And this was another great discussion. So thanks everyone for
Oh, it was
playing
awesome.
along.
Yeah.
All right. Scotty.
Yeah, thank you.
Father
Thanks.
God, we're so grateful for the things we learn and we share with each other, and we study these writings and from antiquity as well as writings from present writers. May each moment that we have of fear and doubt and wondering about how things are going to work out or what way to turn or where to go be so handed over to you, really, not just in voice. We say we handed it to God, but may we really hand our troubles over to you, only to realize that your residency truly is within us. Your word says the kingdom of God that you're looking for is within you. So the answers are there. The provision to solve the problem or the challenge we face has already been provided. We just have to step in, like Jesus says, mustard faith, seed of a mustard seed is what I'm trying to say. Lord, you know what I'm trying to say, and where my heart is and where all our hearts are at. So just be with us and guide us and direct us and animate us to make really good choices so we create really good results, and let your grace and your love proud of us into the lives of those that we encounter. We pray all this, we give our thanks in Jesus' holy name. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, Scott.
Absolutely, guys.
Good night,
Great session.
everybody. It was great.
Good night,
to see you.
everyone.
Night.
Good night,
Good
guys.
discussion.
Thanks for
All right.
welcoming me.
Yeah, come back.
Yeah, come back.
I'll be back.
Good to see you, brother. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
bye. Thank you.
Good night, y'all.